There's some places that you go to and they're just full of things that are peripherally related to comic books. I call that pop culture store. So there's stores at malls that have that. And I like to think that I am a comic book store that has pop culture, not a pop culture store that has comics. My name is Bruce Treat, and I own Comics Adventure. I always had a dream of owning a comic book shop when I was a little boy. I had a whole other career that had nothing to do with comics, and I finagled my wife into letting me try this just over 4 years ago. So far it's been very successful. I've been well received by the people in the community, and I've learned a lot of stuff as a retailer. I'm an old dude, but a new retailer. And the reason we named the shop Comics Adventure is I looked at a lot of comic book stores and I noticed that comics was not in their name. I also feel like life is an adventure. I love the concept of adventure comics. I thought that would be confusing to people because there was a series from DC Comics called Adventure Comics, and so I just transposed the words and voila, Comics Adventure. I have a long history with comic books since I was, knee-high to a grasshopper, as they say. I love them, and I just have the diversity. Anything you want in comics or the comics world, you can come in here and you're going to find it, whether it's Pokemon, cards, or old comics, new comics, large selection of trade paperbacks. We have a section for Pacific Northwest creators. We also have the traditional alphabetical, just A through Z. But I pride myself on having a large, diverse selection of comics and being welcome to the large, diverse comic book community. It's another thing that makes my shop different from a lot of the shops in the Portland metro area is I have a large selection of kids' books, all ages books. Studies have found that kids don't want to read books that are called kids' books. So we call them all ages books. When I was a little boy, comics weren't accepted and they were looked down upon, and I was immediately thought of as dumb. That was the assumption because I read comics and because I didn't read novels, which was incorrect. I did read novels. They just, weren't right in front of me all the time like comics were. I had the best vocabulary of any 4th or 5th grader because I had to look up what titanium was, and I had to look up adamantium and Wolverine. I grew up on the West Coast. We didn't know what a Wolverine was. We thought that was a made-up name. To this day, I'm disappointed that adamantium is not a real metal, but that was an advantage of reading comics, and it still is today. I think that the kids who read them, you use different sensory skills, and your brain works differently when you're reading comics than when you're reading a prose novel. Let me state this emphatically, comics are not for boys anymore. I think they were at one time. That ship long ago sailed. I don't really care who is buying comics from me as long as they are pleasant to deal with and pay their bills on time. That said, the breakdown of my clientele is about 75-25 men to women. It used to be, when I was a kid, you didn't see girls or women in comic shop. They didn't feel like they were welcome. Sometimes they weren't welcome. I think 25% of women is an astounding number. I hope to grow that. The average age of the consumers at Comics Adventure is the early 30s. That said, you're going to get the 60, 70-year-old guy or the 55-year-old woman who comes in and buys comics, and so there are younger ones at the other end too. I think that the older consumer is drawn to the stuff that they have seen all of their life. They'll come in and they will buy the old comics, the back issues. It's their nostalgia period. They're not just getting the superhero stuff though, that's the thing. Black Hammer is the superhero comic for people who are burned out on superheroes. And it's my #1 seller in my shop, both in floppy and in trade paperback. And that's a comic book I've sold to old and young people. The younger people, they're open to experimentation and they buy what they like. I have men that buy traditionally women's comics like Lumberjanes or Paper Girls. And then I have women that buy Avengers and X-Men and they love them. What I always tell people is buy what you like or what you think you're going to like. Try not to speculate, but do keep an open mind. I'm a huge fan of comic books. I own a comic book store, and I still have a passion for them. I love lots of different comics. Some of my current favorites are Black Hammer. I'm also currently loving the House of X and Powers of 10 comics, and I'm excited about the direction that the X-Men books are going with those miniseries. I think that the difference between current comics and previous comics, in some ways they were a little more subtle to a point back in the day, although you did have the famous Captain America cover of him punching Hitler. There was no doubt what the creators and what Captain America's feelings were about Nazis back then. Today it's a little more subtle sometimes. It's also more direct. There's comics that are based around Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's a congresswoman here in New York State. And so there's comic books based on her. There's comic books based on President Trump. And you can go seek those out if you like those people, or if you don't like those people, you can choose to ignore them. As far as social messages, you always got to go back to X-Men. X-Men was started in the early 1960s, I think it was 63, and right there is your direct correlation to the American Civil Rights Movement. It's very easy to look at mutants and people of color and say they're the same, and it just so happened the mutants had wings on their back or beams coming from their eyes or something like that. As far as the industry goes, I think that the comics are far more diverse today than they were when I was growing up in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. Just have a lot of different creators bring their own perspective in. There's a lot more African American writers and artists and colorists in the industry today than there ever was. They're bringing their voice to the table. There's a lot more Asian people, same thing, they bring their voice to the table. Manga is more prevalent in the United States than it's ever been. Women are far more prevalent in comics than they ever were. For a long time, Wonder Woman was written by middle-aged white men, heterosexual white men. That's no longer true. There's women creators writing that, and you don't have to be a woman to write a woman's comic, just like you don't have to be a white man to write a men's comic. So Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing Captain America now. He's an African American man. The world is wide open for more diversity in comics, both with customers and with creative types. People want to see people that look like themselves, whether it's in the movies or on TV shows or in comics, and they're seeing that more today than they ever have in the past. I'm actually bullish on the comic book industry. I think that there's people that are clamoring to get into it, creative types, and tell their story. Maybe people originally thought it was only for superheroes. There's lots of crime noir comics. There's lots of sci-fi comics. There's some romance comics. All of those are back, and if somebody has that one story they want to tell, it's available to be told in comic book form. It's a lot cheaper than movies. I don't know that the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, brought more people into my shop to buy comic books per se. What I do know is that people are far more educated about who the characters are, especially in the Marvel Universe. I do see some people come in and want to read Guardians of the Galaxy comic books or Justice League comic books from DC. What I see more of is they want the Guardians of the Galaxy t-shirt. And I am optimistic that the more you get of that, the more the interest is and the acceptance of comic books as a great art form in America is because people are wearing that Captain America t-shirt or the Iron Man backpack or the Wonder Woman bracelet or something. Trade paperback sales are very good. I still sell far more comic books. I call them floppies. So they're essentially monthly, sometimes they're weekly. Thin ones, they're roughly 30 pages. Trade paperbacks being a compilation of those. I love trade paperbacks, because when I was a kid, you didn't have them. Comic books, kind of like network TV here in the United States, and trade paperbacks are like Netflix or Amazon. And so you can binge read a comic book in a trade paperback. I do have some people that will buy the single issue comics and then they will dip their toe in and buy the trade paperback of certain series that are hard to follow. You just can't remember everything that goes from month to month, especially if there's creator change or thematically in the story. It's all over the place, and I'm looking at you, Doomsday Clock. As of today, 11 issues are out, and I think it's going to be great, but it is very hard to read. And I've had some people come in and say they're just going to wait for the trade paperback when it's collected, and I'm like, I totally understand, and I think you're going to love it when it comes out. Every shop is different, so some shops just sell the heck out of superhero comics, and some shops sell the heck out of independent non-superhero comics. Marvel just tends to flood the market. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. With the current House of X Powers of 10, it's terrific. My independent trade paperbacks, I sell more of those than I sell of DC or Marvel. Part of the reason for that is you got Marvel as one company, and then there's 42 other companies or whatever. I don't sell a lot of Valiant comics in my shop, and I wish I did. The ones that I've read, I've enjoyed. Some of the Bloodshot and Exo stuff is very interesting. I love the concept of faith. I've tried to carry them in my shop, and I've given them a legitimate shot, what I think is a legitimate shot. My market, Valiant, doesn't appeal to them, and I'm a businessman, and I can only carry what sells. I don't sell a lot of European comics that are the traditional monthly comics. I know that Humanoids is one of the publishers, and they've done a lot of, like Meta Barons, I think they did, among others, and some of the Mobius reprints. And they have recently branched out into monthly comics, so Omni and Ignited are two series, and those are not moving for me. My audience needs to be introduced to that stuff to determine whether they like it or not. The Manara comics and the Mobius and Tintin, I have a lot of Tintin comics and everything, but those are old, and so I don't typically know what's fresh. There's not a lot of interest in variant covers. I have a couple people that want every variant of Venom from Marvel, or Immortal Hulk, which is a terrific read from Marvel. But by and large, when I'm looking through the catalog from Diamond, I look at the cover that I think is aesthetically the most interesting to me, and more importantly, the one that I think will sell the best. You know, there's a debate about printing and the digital realm, and it's not just comic books. I think there will always be printed material, and I think the people enjoy the printed material better, and here's why. I'll go grab a comic book, and I will go to a cafe, and I will enjoy a coffee and maybe have some lunch or some dinner, and I will be reading the comic book, and I will be influenced by, or have memories of, what's going on outside that comic book. So by that I mean somebody walks by and they're playing music, or they're whistling, or they're in conversation. And so I always will associate that, man, I'm reading a good comic book and a pretty girl walks by. You never have that with a digital. You just don't. I challenge anybody to tell me that wonderful environmental moment that they had when they were swiping across this Kindle screen about the pretty girl walking by, or the bird that swooped in to grab a little morsel of food on the table next to you. I hope you should come to America, and come to specifically the northwest corner of the United States in Portland, Oregon. You'll come to Comics Adventure and say hello to me.